Good morning. I think I'm streaming again. It's April 3rd, 2020. This is likely to be a short edition of this because when I got up today to try to find the data, I found that the format of the data had changed for the source that I use for my states and counties report. And though I madly tried to correct for that, I don't think I quite got it. So this may be nothing but countries. The countries also had changed. I do think that I managed to fix that up. It's one of the standing facts of the job of a data scientist is that you spend most of your job wrangling the data, and that this morning suddenly hit me with a bunch of wrangling on the latest numbers. So anyway, here I am. We'll talk countries. So the total countries graph, United States continues to be in the lead. Doesn't seem to be growing too sharply, but I think we'll find out on the next graph. Just as of yesterday, it was still looking, or it was not still, it was beginning to look exponential as on a series of days in a row. So that was not good news for the United States yesterday as it began to unturn its corner. Spain has definitely replaced Italy, which has this nice downward curve. I'm going to zoom down to the new cases. Actually, I'm going to zoom down to the new cases. This is the new cases per million. That was the new cases. This is per million. I prefer to look at it per capita, so here we are per capita where we can actually compare one country to another reasonably. Certainly the standout here is Italy. Italy continues to peak and head downward in new cases per day. That's great news. Norway also looks like it's doing something good here. It's got an angle that's almost flat and certainly flatter than most of the other countries. The general theme here is that most countries are still growing in new cases per day. We're seeing more and more new cases per day. When that stops, you'll see the line of that country become flat as Italy has and then begin to drop. If I can grab this somewhere, Austria is another one that seems to be flattening out. But the real place to see this is on the rope chart. Here on my favorite graph, the rope chart, we see the broad trend of where growth is headed by the countries of the world. So this, to my eye, the broad trend is downward. Certainly you can see that even a few weeks ago there was this sharp upward trend of the whole rope. All the countries were rising in new cases every day, or not just rising in new cases, but their growth rates of new cases every day were rising. They were getting more and more new cases every day, and that growth rate was accelerating. And then around March 13th to 15th, they turned, this isn't the turning the corner I normally talk about, but they turned a kind of a corner where their growth rates stopped increasing and their growth rate started decreasing as a whole, and that has continued in a pretty linear fashion all the way down to here. So we can see as these countries reach zero, more and more of them will see their growth stop in new cases. They'll still be getting new cases each day, but they'll be getting fewer and fewer of them. This zero line, to my mind, well, what I see here, to my eye, I see two things. I see kind of the major rope, where the top of the rope is right about here, and where everyone is moving kind of in parallel. And that rope has almost passed zero as a whole. It has there are a number of countries that are below zero and are seeing negative growth rate now. There are a few countries that seem to be a few days from hitting zero, but that's the major rope. But then we have all these, I can't call them outliers because there are quite a lot of them, but there's sort of a different trend. I'll call them the new epicenters, or the up and coming epicenters, where the trend is towards daily growth increases of 15 to 25%. These are exponentially growing countries. So the rope as a whole, most countries are doing pretty well at getting over this, turning the corner, and heading towards negative growth of new cases each day, but there are a few that aren't. So let's zoom in on the few to start with. First of all, I'm not going to grab the whole of Turkey here, but I know it's Turkey because Turkey looks different from everyone, though actually I'll take it just a moment. The broad shape of its curve is the same as the others. There was this linear upward movement of growth, a peak, and then a linear downward movement. Turkey is much more, much sharper. It moved later. It moved faster. It moved to a much higher peak of 70% daily growth rate, and then it moved more sharply back down. So Turkey is exaggerating the movement of the rest of the rope. But on the bright side, Turkey has turned the corner here as of today. You wouldn't have believed it a couple days ago because they were way up in the stratosphere there, above the entire chart. But they've had a few good days apparently. Let's take a look at Turkey more closely on the day-by-day basis. Yeah, so they've had 4 days in a row where their growth has been practically zero in new cases. This is a moving average. We're averaging 3 days to make each one of these points, so it's you won't see that quite if you look at the raw data, but the trend, the average movement, I'm doing this average to get rid of some of the noise, so really big points or really small points don't blow everything away. We have these 4 days, maybe 5, that have been very good, that are starting to definitely counteract the upper ones, and we see a downward trend. So here it is hitting zero on the 3rd, today. That is today, right? Yes, on the 3rd today, Turkey hits zero. Turkey seems to be turning a corner. They've been looking good for a few days. So Turkey, for all its flamboyance in making its curve much more impressive than everyone else, also seems to have reached zero at about the same time as everyone else. So again, I was going to focus on those above the zero, above the general trend of the rope, which are these 5. These are the ones that are growing and have the potential to be real problems in the coming days. Russia, not very high on our list of 25, I think it is, but Russia right now has a trend that's not very pretty, 25% daily growth. Russia looked good for a while there, but now not so much. Its cases are growing and growing. Reported cases, I should clearly say. Brazil, I was projecting that Brazil had turned the corner about 4 days ago, and on one of the threads that I follow, someone was looking at my projection and said, no, Brazil has the potential to blow up. And I think the argument, I imagine, that in that case was that that Brazil's president and others in power there don't seem to be taking it seriously, or maybe they're trying to pull a UK, which is to say, let's just let everyone get the disease, then we'll be over it quickly, we'll all have immunity and we can move on while the rest of the country is locked in place for however many months. The UK didn't have the will to hold that position. I'm not saying it was a good position, but it looked like they were heading that way to begin with. But the rest of the world kind of peer pressured them into lockdown, and Brazil at this point is not locking down as in the news that I've seen. So this may be the result. Brazil, having taken this whole epidemic rather lightly, is now seeing this prolonged period of above the zero growth after that period that had me thinking they were doing well, where they had quite a few below negative growth days. Now they've got a series of days above the, not just above the line, but 56% growth, day over day, 43% growth, 30% growth. Now you might say that's a tiny trend line down, but I wouldn't count on it yet. So Brazil has lost its recovery momentum. It was looking much better a few days ago. Looking back at some of the other of the upper cluster then, Denmark, Scandinavia, when I first started tracking this, was always in the high percentages of growth. Sweden, Norway have not been dominant in the top. I think it was those three especially that were, well, I stand corrected. Here's Sweden. I thought Sweden was doing better, but yeah, so here's our Scandinavian cluster still doing 13% growth. We've seen worse for sure, but Sweden and Denmark are moving in lockstep here, and they're both angled slightly upward, not improving, not reducing their number of cases. Indeed, they are growing their number of cases. So that's not good. We can hope they'll turn around again. I want to say that Norway used to be up here and then up in this upper clump, and that they've done better. Actually, why don't I just check that? Are they here? Norway isn't very high on the total list, but I don't have a way to go back and say what was the projection a week ago, but it certainly looks like if we threw out the current week of Norway data, they also would be upward trending up to around here. And then suddenly, things, not so suddenly, but things have gotten better. And so Norway does seem to have turned the corner, but its siblings are not doing so well. We still have Denmark and Sweden growing exponentially. The UK, as I mentioned, took a pretty blasé approach to the epidemic to begin with. Maybe that's why they haven't recovered as fast as some, but they are at least headed slightly in the right direction now. They've got all these dots above zero. Every day they've had more and more cases. Not just more cases, but even more cases on average than the day before. More new cases. But their growth rate at 12 roughly percent and slightly dropping, so we can imagine this trend line indicating the United Kingdom recovering in, or turning the corner towards recovery in a week or two. Not quite as on the road to recovery as some, but it's better than some too. And then Canada, also Canada's doing much of what the UK has done. Let's just zoom in on Canada and see. In terms of trend, I mean, Canada is much of what the UK is. Lots of very high growth a couple weeks ago. All of these in the 40% range. Each day, 40% new cases. It does not take very many days of 40% new cases to start to see a lot of cases. Let's just look at what their cases really look like now. 1,000 total. It's certainly not, doesn't put them in the lead or anything like it, with all these countries doing 5,000. But and I guess that's mostly the news is good for Canada. They had a high growth rate, but they started low in total cases, and now they seem to have put a lid on their growth rate. It's mostly under 20% here, and the trend line is slightly downward. So with luck, Canada is not going to become one of those major five-figure players in the total cases. So those are the big ones of the losers of the pack. Let's look at the winners. Australia. Australia is looking great. Their trend line is downward in growth. Austria as well. It's funny how Austria and Australia seem to form a pack, apparently based entirely on the alphabet. Austria is dropping. Its growth rate is dropping at 11% per day, growth rate in new cases. So just as a 20% daily growth rate can blow you up from nothing to a whole lot in a very short time, a solid negative growth rate will shrink your new cases in days. You can have 10,000 new cases a day, and next day you have 9,000, next day you have 8,000 roughly. And so it shrinks down, it flattens out that curve pretty quickly if you can get people in this range. We have not seen this very much of countries this far below zero. So this is great news for the world as a whole. We're seeing countries that are really decelerating in their new cases. These are pretty good as well. Germany, South Korea, Italy. Italy I am always so happy to see Italy here because they have been such an epicenter. And now here, look at Italy. 6% reduction of cases. It's sustained. Let's look at their dots. This is a lovely graph for Italy to be seeing, as their new cases have tapered off, and we saw that showing up very prominently on this graph, where Italy is completely bucking the trend of upward new cases. The world seems to be headed upward for the most part still, but not Italy. And this is kind of like New York. Italy is the world as New York is to the United States when it comes to coronavirus, where we were seeing this trend where it looked like the United States as a whole was heading down to hit zero very soon, and it seemed like that was due to New York. New York had turned this corner and was doing better and better in terms of new cases, and since it was the dominant, by far, input to the United States total numbers, the United States was looking good. And so it is with Italy. The world as a whole, I do not have a chart that shows the graph of the world as a whole. Maybe I should make one. But with Italy being a fairly important input to the world, at least it was, seeing it drop off is part of why the world has been dropping overall, and why we're seeing we're not yet at the turning point for the whole world, but seeing Italy drop away is certainly good news for the graph of the whole world, because it's maybe second or third place. Of course, to really see the world drop, we need to see the United States drop, and maybe Spain. Let's take a look at Spain. And indeed, here comes Spain, second place, I think, in the whole world. Spain does not show the pronounced downward curve on the new daily cases graph that Italy does. So it's not as clear that it's turning the corner as it is for Italy, and it's just barely starting to touch that zero line here. If we compare Italy and Spain, we can see, well, they completely track each other. It's just that Spain has been just a little bit higher percentage-wise the entire time. These two are running in perfect parallel. So good news for Italy and Spain, good news for the world curve as a whole, but the United States, let's look at the United States as well. Well, actually, not looking so bad there either. Oh, actually good news for the United States. I was, I'm just remembering some anchor criticizing Biden, it probably was, for coughing into his hand and saying that's so old generation. And now I've gone and done it. I promise I'll wash my hands after this. I try to cough into my elbow. The United States, though, there is this mini trend that we were seeing. First of all, there was the broad trend that originally suggested it would turn the corner around the 31st of March. And right before it got there, it got into this mini trend. You know, one can, what do they say? One can be a accident, two might be a coincidence, but three is starting to be a habit. We had 4 in a row of this habit of the United States of getting more and more growth in new cases every day. And so, far from getting fewer cases each day, we were getting more and more each day. Fortunately, this one day is nothing to really hang a trend on, but it is a rolling mean of 3 days, a moving average, and so there's some hope here that the United States might be breaking its habit and heading back down, but we've got to have some points below zero before the trend line can be below zero. We have to have some day or some series of days, in 3 days in a row, where the average is actually negative, where the total new cases is below what the previous total new cases was. Not happening yet for the United States. And sadly, since I don't have state data at my fingertips right now, I can't quite say why this is, but I'm going to speculate that it's not because of New York and it's not because of New Jersey, because recent days have shown those two doing well and improving. I'm going to speculate that it's because of California, that it's because of Michigan, that it's because of Illinois, and it's because of Louisiana. And another way of saying it is that Some of the other big cities have caught it. Los Angeles, Michigan, I know it's not a big city. Michigan, Detroit is the particular one that looks like it's getting hit in Michigan. Chicago, New Orleans. These cities show poor trends right now, and I will try to get my state data back online shortly and probably do another live stream, maybe even later today, to actually cover that, at least in brief, the state news. But if the state news were great, then the United States news would be great, and since the United States is still obviously not great, at least some of the states must be pulling it upwards, even though New York and New Jersey have been doing better. And for all I know, without looking at the data, maybe New York and New Jersey have unturned their corner too, and they're the ones pulling it up here. But I'm guessing not. New York has been doing world-class testing, and I'm guessing we're going to see that the things pulling it down are California, before I mentioned, California, Michigan, maybe Illinois, and New Orleans, whatever the state is that has New Orleans in it, Louisiana. So back a little bit more to look at this, at the downward rope. Other states that are, countries that are doing well: Norway, Netherlands, Germany, Italy, we talked about already. Those ones are doing well in terms of actually having turned the corner according to the trend line. And then we have Spain, Belgium, Turkey, we talked about, Israel, Portugal, Chile, that are headed downward but haven't hit zero yet. So these are still in exponential growth, but they're flattening out and they're heading for linear or less than linear pretty soon. They're going to be seeing their curves top out and the number of new cases drop. Let's see. I've already been on for a while here. I'm focusing much more on the countries since I don't have anything else to talk about. But let's look at some interesting facts here about deaths. I'm just going to spend a little bit of time on deaths and then I'll wrap this up. We can see from the new deaths that the deaths have leveled off in Italy. I talked about this before. Surprising, since we've just leveled off in new cases. But for whatever reason, the trends continue. Italy still is showing about the same number of deaths day over day. It's a lot of deaths, 800 deaths every day, but whereas it looked like they might be heading up to thousands of deaths in a matter of days, not happening. They've leveled off not just their growth in new cases curve, but their growth in new deaths curve. This looks perfectly flat to me. It's not dropping yet quite, but it's flat. Iran appears to be dropping according to the reported data. Some of these curves, Spain is looking like it's starting to level off. The United States is not. Maybe it's heading towards flat. We'll look at this in a more valuable way or more useful way, in my opinion, by looking at, well, this is per million. We'll take a quick look. Per million doesn't change that much. Spain and Italy still the leaders. Belgium jumps up when you look at it per million as having a death problem, coronavirus death problem. This isn't United States. Netherlands. Okay, this graph does look substantially different than the one above. When we look per capita, Netherlands is not doing so great. It's in its fifth place, looks like, in per capita deaths. I used to live in the Netherlands. I used to live in Utrecht, which for everyone who doesn't live in the Netherlands is Utrecht. I also see Switzerland rising here, and Switzerland not looking so great. But really, in terms of not looking so great, let's look at the rope chart. This is the thing that really gives us the where these countries are headed, not just where they are now. When I look at this, I see an outlier here. Australia is seeing fewer and fewer deaths and has been for a long time. Or maybe Australia just doesn't have data. I'm not going to believe too much what I'm seeing here, but there are reported numbers of deaths that have been dropping, and there's a lot of zeros, which I believe just means I've filled in data. It used to be that these lines didn't go all the way to the end. Those of you who have been my loyal fans for many days now may remember that some of the lines didn't go to the ends, and I eventually fixed that. I think it's kind of a bug in the plotting algorithm, but I worked around that at least by adding in zeros that made the plotter happier. But that does tend to trend the line towards zeros for places that are missing data. So I'm not going to pay too much attention to Australia right here because it seems to be missing some of its data. South Korea, number of cases dropping. We really would expect this in South Korea. I'm going to zoom in further because South Korea was ahead of the curve in both the sense of getting the disease a lot faster and in implementing testing a lot better, and so it should be near the end of its epidemic. And this curve suggests that for some days, here again we're having zeros reported. For some days, though, well, I don't know if I can say that. Well, okay, the data we do have, I don't know whether those data are real zeros or fillers, but for the days we do have, certainly their trend is good. A 42% reduction, a 9% reduction, a 5% reduction in deaths each day, in new deaths each day. So the trend is probably positive for South Korea. And you would expect that from what the news tells us. For the rest of it, actually I'm going to zoom out, the trend is very flat. It's very level. We are seeing somewhere around this 20% line, maybe 15% is the middle of the rope. So we are seeing epidemic growth, exponential growth in new cases, new deaths, without an obvious trend that it's recovering. And we would expect this. This is what we were seeing a couple weeks ago in new cases, and the deaths will happen after the new cases. I've talked some in past videos about how long we really can expect it to be from new cases to new deaths. It might be shorter than you expect, but if it were 2 weeks, then we would expect that this would follow the trend of the new cases by a couple weeks. Maybe it's a week, or even as little as 5 days. But we see some that are running away. Turkey, which as we've seen is recovering now in cases, is not yet recovering deaths. It is still seeing exponential growth in new deaths as all those extremely large number of cases per capita at least are working their way through the healthcare system and ending in many cases in death. Russia as well is seeing a growth. But the broad trend is horizontal, which at least means we're not seeing a growth in the growth rate. We're at least seeing a roughly steady growth rate. This graph is kind of a mess. There are a lot of them headed downward in a very positive way, like Germany or Czech Republic. There are some that are headed upwards in a very unfortunate way, like Denmark and Brazil, and there's Brazil again, showing its colors as it seems to be headed towards much more serious epidemic than it's seen in Russia. So one of these days we're going to see India pop in this graph, I fear, but remarkably India is still not even in the top 25 in deaths or in cases. Watch this space though. It's hard to believe with what we're seeing in India right now that there won't be something pretty alarming happening there in a matter of days, even weeks, or maybe they'll handle it. They're trying to shelter in place, and people are moving away from the major metropolitan cities to try to shelter in the countryside, and maybe we will see India actually dodge this. So yeah, the broad trend of deaths is flat for the country, and I'd say very random for the different countries. Flat for the world and random for the different countries. I can't say that this is a downward or an upward trend at this point. It will certainly turn downward eventually, but we can't see when that's going to be yet. So that's the world news at the country level. I'm Greg Farrar. Again, I do not have my state and county information today. They changed the data format, and I'm going to have to recover from that. It's not going to be too hard. I'll certainly have it by tomorrow, but I showed up here at my workstation 15 minutes before showtime and found that all my charts were broken. Managed to get the country working, but not the other two. So those will come either later today or I'll just pick it up tomorrow. I expect I'll be back on tomorrow. Thank you for listening.